Talk to me. I, ca- I don't know if you can hear me, but I can't hear you.
Go down to your microphone in the lower left. You can, and we are.
If I do that, it mutes me.
Why don't you reboot?
I'll read the questions and then I'll mute.
Okay.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for hanging in. And again, a huge welcome to you, Dr. Rosensweet. Good to see you. Welcome to me and all the women and everybody who's coming up live and also watching the playbacks. Question number 1. We have 2 on SHBG, and you're always really good at explaining that sex hormone binding globulin. Sex hormone binding globulin. So, does Dr. R ever state what an optimal level of sex hormone binding globulin should be? I started taking a medication for my thyroid, and it feels as if my SHBG is high, as I'm not feeling I am getting any estradiol into my body at all. How does he know what is too high of an SHBG anyway?
The sex hormone binding globulin. It depends what your blood to. The different laboratories have, for example, LabCorp, the limit of the normal of their reference range, whereas Quest, and these are moving target and change. So always tell patients sex hormone binding globulin and right so that laboratories we're going to see whether it's range or whether it falls out. And for even significant elevation, okay, sound. So why entirely? Start entirely.
Thank you for your patience. I know Dr. R is like diligently working on this. So thank you for your patience. I'm hoping you heard my question because I did ask it, and give us a little bit, and yeah, I can sing you a song. Hang in. I may have to reboot myself. Um, but he'll be back, as he always is. So funny because on my left it says everyone can see and hear me, but I'm not used to just being here alone. So come on, Dr. R, you could do it. You could do it. We are back.
How about now? Do we have sound now?
Parfait.
Okay. Why don't you ask the question again, Carolyn, and I'll begin it again.
Will do. Does Dr. R, excuse me, ever state what an optimal level of SHBG should be, sex hormone binding globulin? I started taking a medication for my thyroid, and it feels as if my SHBG is high, as I am not feeling that I'm getting any estradiol into my body at all. How does he know what is too high of an SHBG?
It's a good question.
It is.
I think I'd like to start right from the beginning and describe what SHBG is. It stands for sex hormone binding globulin. Globulin, these very large proteins, and one of the places they're found is in the blood. And they have a very specific purpose related to sex hormones. Sex hormones are fat soluble. That means when the ovary, for example, produces some estrogen, it puts it out into the bloodstream, but that estrogen cannot float around in the bloodstream as a little fat globule. like salad
Oompa loompa.
like salad dressing. It doesn't work that way. We don't want fat globules floating around in the bloodstream because they won't mix with the water. So the body has a mechanism in which it binds the hormones that are produced by the testicles or by the ovaries to proteins. They attach to proteins, and that's how they're transported around to the various cells of the body. When they reach the various cells of the body, the protein releases them into the cells. There are several proteins that sex hormones bind to. One of them is sex hormone binding globulin. And there's others too. There's albumin, there's other binding globulins, but the one that binds it best in the highest quantities is sex hormone binding globulins. And the different sex hormones bind to sex hormone binding globulin with different degrees of strongness. For example, dihydrotestosterone is the tightest binding thing to sex hormone binding globulin, followed by testosterone, followed by the estrogens. But all these sex hormones bind to sex hormone binding globulin. It's natural. It's fantastic.
Not dangerous?
And it's no, not at all. It's not an illness at all. And not only that, it's a protective mechanism. So let's say, for example, you have a 22-year-old woman happens to be at the peak of her output of her ovaries in her whole life. She'll never produce more hormones than she will at 22. And then she decides to take additional hormones on top of the ones she's already producing, which would be in the form of a birth control pill. The birth control pill has extra estrogen in there and a funky artificial molecule called the progestin. Well, that extra estrogen, the body's going to go, whoa, wait a minute. We've got all the estrogen we need, and now we're getting some extra estrogen? Well, no big deal. We'll just protect ourselves from the excessive amounts of estrogen by increasing the amount of sex hormone binding globulin that we make, and we'll just bind up the extra. That's how the body protects itself. So not only is sex hormone binding globulin normal, it's part of a protective mechanism should there be excessive hormone levels.
May I ask?
Yeah.
Does it happen that we just bind up sex hormone binding globulin for whatever reason and then we don't get the hormones we need?
Well, I'd like to rephrase what I'm understanding of your question. We don't bind up sex hormone binding globulin. Sex hormone binding globulin is produced by the liver. And just for the example I was using in a young woman, if she's producing additional sex hormone binding globulin beyond her natural amounts, in order to bind up the extra estrogen she's getting from the birth control pill, to protect her from elevated levels of estrogen, well, she winds up binding up other things too. In
Mm.
fact, she'll bind up her testosterone even stronger than she will the estrogen. And there's a lot of young women who go on the birth control pill and they lose their libido because they've bound up their testosterone because they went ahead and produced some extra sex hormone binding globulin to protect themselves from the additional estradiol that was in that birth control pill. That's just an example, a practical example, a very practical example of what happens with sex hormone binding globulin. Now, I'd like to turn to the actual question, because the question was, what's the normal level? Well, like any laboratory test, any blood test, for example, each different laboratory has their own normal ranges or reference ranges, they're called. And so it depends which laboratory that blood that was drawn was sent to define what's the optimal amount. And the right amount of sex hormone binding globulin falls within the reference range of the specific laboratory. And wouldn't you know, they vary laboratory to laboratory. So, for example, one famous American laboratory, Quest, they usually use a reference range at the top of it is 79. And another very famous and excellent American medical laboratory, LabCorp, they use a different reference range, although it depends what LabCorp you're working with, what part of the country you're in. The upper limit of their sex hormone binding globulin is something like 125. There isn't a problem there. It's just any healthcare provider will draw the blood and take a look at the result. And whatever that result is, they'll see whether it is within the reference range or not, because the laboratory prints the result, and then right next to it, it prints the reference range. So, for example, if you're using LabCorp, you could have a sex hormone binding globulin of 100, and you look to the right and you see the reference range. The upper limit would be 125, so that would be within the reference range. But if you made the mistake and you thought, well, I know what the reference range is because I use Quest all the time, and you're looking at a LabCorp report and you see 100 and you think the upper limit of normal is 79, you'll think, well, this must be elevated. Well, no one's going to make that error. But I'm mentioning it because sometimes patients can make that error. So what's the right number? Depends on the lab you're using. Now, one of the statements in the question was a little bit of a surprise to me. The patient feels like her sex hormone binding globulin is too high. I've never heard that comment in 28 years of specializing in this. Ain't nobody feels what their sex hormone binding globulin is any more than they feel what their serum SGOT is. You don't feel those things unless they're outrageously off the charts. Now, it doesn't mean she's not feeling that things aren't working. I respect that. You betcha.
Mhm.
But we don't know that why they're not working is a sex hormone binding globulin problem. Well, let's just pretend there isn't enough information in that question. Let's just pretend it is a sex hormone binding globulin, because sex hormone binding globulin sometimes is problematic. So there's many women who enter menopause, and we care so much about the sex hormone binding globulin that always, prior to treating a woman, we're doing a certain amount of testing. We're not testing her hormone levels, but we are testing her sex hormone binding globulin. We want to see if it's normal or not. Now, it's very common to see a woman in menopause have a slightly or moderately elevated sex hormone binding globulin. How in the heck did that happen? Well, it turns out that when a woman goes on the birth control pill, in most instances, the sex hormone binding globulin is going to elevate to protect against the extra estrogen. And then when she stops the birth control pill, the best thing that could happen is the sex hormone binding globulin would go back to normal, which it does a lot of the time. However, not all of the time. Sometimes the sex hormone binding globulin, once it goes up, it stays up.
Which is my second question, so I can really interject this in here because the second question, which I really don't have to repeat, she says, and she did take birth control pills at one point of her life, and she wants to know if the high sex hormone binding globulin can stay that way and be permanent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Permanent's another question, but it can go up when she's young, and when she stops the birth control pill, it cannot go down. And that's a very common situation. We see that very commonly.
Is there
There's other reasons why the sex hormone binding globulin can be elevated above the reference range. Some people genetically just produce higher levels of sex hormone binding globulin. Now, when the laboratory report comes back for a woman that I'm working with in menopause, and I see an elevated sex hormone binding globulin, I don't do something like, oh my God. I don't tell her that because it may or may not be an issue at all. I'll just say, oh, the sex hormone binding globulin is elevated, but no big deal. It's not an illness, no problem. Because a lot of the time, even though it's slightly elevated or even moderately elevated, it's not a problem. She's in menopause. She got a slightly elevated or moderately elevated sex hormone binding globulin. We give her hormones, and there's no problem. She just behaves. She responds to the hormones. She feels better, great. And the sex hormone binding globulin does not change. In fact, that's very common. So we don't care if it's slightly elevated or moderately elevated. We just want to see what it's going to do. In some cases, when we give her hormones, the sex hormone binding globulin is actually going to go up as a natural function. It was a certain level, even though slightly elevated. We gave her additional hormones, it went up to, quote, protect her. In those instances, and that does occur, it's pretty rare. I think I have 2 patients right now in my practice that we have an ongoing sex hormone binding globulin issue. In those rare instances, we need to treat. We need to administer a substance which will lower the sex hormone binding globulin, and we do. And that substance is called danazol, and we give it to women in low doses, and invariably it will reduce that sex hormone binding globulin. And we find the exact amount, the lowest amount possible to keep the sex hormone binding globulin reasonable. And it's not hard. We can use really low doses, especially compared to the high doses of danazol that are given to women who have endometriosis, for example. And some women need to have that as part of their program. Now, there's other things that can raise sex hormone binding globulin, and one of the more common one is if a woman's on the pellets, for example, and she got too high a dose. Bingo, it could raise the sex hormone binding globulin. Or another common one is if she's on thyroid hormone, but she's on too much thyroid hormone.
which is back to question number 1.
These excessive amounts of thyroid hormone can elevate the sex hormone binding globulin. So the good news is that there's some human beings on planet Earth that actually take on as their life's work the practice of medicine, and they go to medical school and they learn a lot. Just like there are some human beings that they get fascinated by the automobile and they become mechanics and they do 10,000 tune-ups and overhauls and what else. And when you take your car to them, they know a lot. And they're the ones you want to take your car to. You want to take your car to someone who's been trained and has a lot of experience. So you don't have to worry so much about sex hormone binding globulin, because everything in menopause comes down to one single job that women have. There is a job for a woman in menopause or perimenopause, but there's only a single job you really need to do. Is you need to go shopping to find a healthcare provider that you really like, that you can talk to, that you trust, and they've taken on a special education around hormones and menopause. Or for men, they've taken on a special education for treating men with hormones because these are the most powerful biochemicals in our body. We want to get this one right, and there's a lot of moving parts. So I don't want you to be overwhelmed by the details of sex hormone binding globulin or 50 other subjects that relate to menopause.
And our cars.
Yes, your job is always the same. And sometimes it's a piece of work. But nowadays with telemedicine, oh my God, there's so much more greater opportunity. All you have to do is find a licensed healthcare provider, a physician or a nurse practitioner, or depending on what state you're in, you can even, there's a few states that even compounding pharmacists can dispense. You need a physician or nurse practitioner or PA that you like, you trust, and who's had special training, special education in treating women in menopause with compounded bioidentical hormones. That's your job. That's your only job. You can learn a lot. You can read our book. You can download it from Ins and Outs of Menopause. Carolyn's made it available. Free PDF copy. You can learn a lot, and it's useful. And we love to partner these discovery individualization programs with women. That's why I wrote the book. You can be an active participant, but I'll tell you, if you have a good provider, you don't have to do anything but go to them.
Well, it's true.
Like I take my car into the mechanic and they want to explain to me, this is what we did. I said, no need. I like you. I trust you. Just do your thing. I
Keep
got
it for as
a
long
lot
as
of
you
other
like.
things. Got a lot of other things to think about. Thank you. So that's your job. And then you won't have to be concerned about the details of sex hormone binding globulin, because it sounds like the challenge that the woman is having, those two questioners are having, is they know enough because they probably had to seek out some information to try and figure out what the heck's going on. But there's a lot involved, so you got to know how to test for thyroid properly when you see an elevated sex hormone binding globulin.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of moving parts there. These moving parts are fun and easy to understand for someone who's had the training, but they're just confounding when you try and when you're dealing with little bits and pieces of the whole picture. Moral of the story: sex hormone binding globulin is a normal, natural thing. It's not an illness. An elevated sex hormone binding globulin is not an illness. It's addressable if need be. A lot of times you don't have to do anything about it. And that's sex hormone binding globulin for you.
Wrapped up in 10 minutes. Thank you, Dr. Rosensweet. I always like talking about sex hormone binding globulin with you because I had to learn how to pronounce it for one back
Yes,
in the day.
that's the hardest part.
Right, exactly. Always got it wrong. Get it right now. So I'm going to move on to question number 3, which says, does Dr. Rosensweet ever talk about HRT, CBHRT being stressful on our bodies? The more I read of all the side effects uh, that one can get from hormones, or I can get from hormones, the more I'm believing that all can well be adrenal related. I read that the better the adrenals work, the better one can handle hormones.
There's several issues to unpack within that. And one is there's no such thing as side effects with hormones. They're molecules that are already present in the body, and so you don't get side effects if you do it properly.
Right.
There are definite effects, adverse effects from too much hormones. So if in the process of being treated, you wind up being treated with excessive amounts of hormones, you are going to get into problems. Nothing urgent, They're usually just symptoms and things that are easily correctable. But overdose or insufficient dose has issues, but they're not called side effects. Side effects happen when you give a human being a molecule that is not currently present in their body. And the body's going to react to that. Those are called medicines. And we capitalize upon the reactions that the bodies have to these medications. But these medications are often strong and they can have untoward effects, unexpected effects, unintended consequences. That's not true with hormones. That molecule is already present in your body, especially if you're using a bioidentical one. So you don't get these unattended effects. But if you give too much or you don't give enough, there are going to be adversities, guaranteed. So I just wanted to correct that around the issue of side effects. Now, so the flip side of that is, if you're on a hormone program and you're not feeling right, one of two things is taking place. It's not properly, impeccably individualized and adjusted for you right into the optimal sweet spot for every one of the 4 hormones that we're talking about. Or there's other medical issues going on. And someone who's trained, healthcare provider, I'm talking about a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a PA, they're going to know about that. They're going to go, wow, not getting the kind of response I'd expect, and this is a pretty good program. Gee, maybe I better go looking for other issues. So that's to be taken into account. Now, the third thing that was mentioned there was the adrenal glands. Are the adrenal glands important? Whew! Yes, they are. There's several hormones coming out of the adrenal glands. Some of the most powerful hormones in our body. Adrenaline, whoa. Cortisol, whoa. DHEA, well, that's a prohormone, but cortisol and adrenaline are very, very powerful. And there's a lot of strain on the adrenal glands because they're at the vanguard of the biochemical response to fight or flight. When we got attacked by saber-toothed tigers, we had to mobilize. We had to take a stand or run like heck. And the biology that's produced internally to do that is just phenomenal. I mean, mothers have been known to lift cars off their entrapped children. How in the heck did they get that strength? Well, that's the power of those biochemicals, adrenaline and cortisol. Now, they're not the only hormones that are recruited for the stress response. So is estrogen, so is testosterone. Oh, isn't that fascinating? So is thyroid. But because we're in 2020, which is, there's AC/DC or there's BC or AD.
All those?
Well, there's also BCAD and BC.
You're confusing me.
The third BC, the second BC is before consciousness. We're at a very, very primitive time in human consciousness.
That is true.
We've got rocket ships and we've got computers, but take a look at the state of the planet right now. How much ignorance, how much lack of wisdom, how much lack of golden rule is going on. The unconsciousness is rampant. And part of the unconsciousness is when someone gets bent out of shape for one reason or another, there's very few folks who have the wisdom and the skills and the education to do a really good job with uncomfortable emotions. More commonly, they blame somebody else and throw a bomb at them, in worst case scenario, or they don't know what to do. But in all the cases where they don't know what to do, they're also going to go so far as to not use their mind and emotion to solve the challenge. They're going to trigger the full biological fight or flight response, the outpouring of biochemicals at the vanguard of which is the adrenal hormones. Others are brought into play. The ovaries, the testicles, the thyroid, they're also brought in, but the adrenals are at the vanguard. And you do that day in and day out from the age of 2 to the age of 20s, 30s, 40s. Man, you put a strain on those adrenals, and they lose the capability of putting out a robust response. So adrenal deficiency can be part of what's going on in midlife.
One thing I'm noticing that a word you're not saying is fatigue, like
Yeah,
adrenal.
I
Yeah.
don't, fatigue to me in medicine refers to a very specific thing. I'm tired. I wake up, I feel low energy. I'm in the middle of the day, I feel low and I'm tired. That's what fatigue means. We don't know that the adrenal glands feel fatigue. What we do know is there's so much demand on them for so long. And when you're young, they'll rise to that demand. They'll even produce more hormones than you actually need at a basic level. They'll do that for a while, and the science has been done on this, but they can't keep up with it. And somewhere along the line, usually in the 40s or the 50s, sometimes in the 30s, even the 20s, the adrenal glands stop producing the robust hormonal response. They just can't do it anymore. And you wind up getting low levels of adrenal hormones. Because the adrenals are so crucial for life, they're the last thing to go.
Mm.
A lot of things are going to be recruited and diminished prior to the adrenals, but they'll go too, sooner or later. And so we always think in midlife people, well, is low adrenal hormones part of the problem? It's no problem for us. We can test and find out. Like, for example, my favorite way to find out if someone is low in cortisol is I do the 24-hour urine hormone test. There's other ways to test that. They're quite reliable. Even saliva works for cortisol, not for ovarian hormones. No, 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 no. But yes for cortisol and yes for DHEA. So there's a lot of ways to test if someone's low. Interestingly enough, we run 24-hour urines on 100% of the women in menopause. And what percentage of the time do I see that it really this trouble got so deep is that it led to lower levels of adrenal hormones? Very low. 5% of the patients actually show up with adrenal numbers that are significantly low.
What
We
do you
see
do?
evidence. Well, I'll get there. We see evidence of adrenals that are not putting out 20-year-old levels of the levels that are put out by a 20-year-old. We see evidence of decline, but we see usually enough. Now, in a menopausal woman who's also a little low in corticosteroids and cortisol, usually all we have to do is replenish the estrogens and the progesterone and the testosterone, and she'll bounce back the corticosteroids all on their own. Rarely, we got to treat that adrenal gland right up front. I mean rare, in my experience. I'd say 1% of the women that we see, this is over 28 years, we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women, 1 to 2% of the time we'll want to give them cortisol as well. Now, I'm about to go to a major event, a major seminar. There'll be 3, 4, 5,000 doctors there. And one of the things I'm speaking at that event, but one of the things I'm going early because there's a European physician who's an expert on hormones, and he's giving a full day workshop one day prior to the main conference. And one of his things that he's going to talk about is cortisol, the most important hormone. So I know this gentleman, and I know he's going to say, boy, we should be treating with more cortisol. I don't know. There's all kinds of ways to look at it. Mainly, there were several parts to that questionnaires question there, and we do pay attention to the adrenal glands, but I think they've gotten an oversignificance that what turns out in midlife women, for example, yes, they may be a little low in their corticosteroids, but you do not have to treat them with cortisol. You'll see the magic. If you replenish the estrogens and the androgens, the corticosteroids are going to bounce back all on their own because the resources are no longer going to be spread amongst the need to produce all those hormones. So there's going to be a lot more left over for the adrenal glands to recover the cortisol. And then rarely we do treat with cortisol.
Got it. Yeah, so that's gonna lead me into another interview day
Mhm.
about, yeah, us and behavior and fight or flight and all that stuff. And that conference sounds really good, by the way. Just saying. Anyway, thank you. Um, Question number 4. So when I started hormone replacement therapy, my appetite went through the roof, this questioner says. And she says, and it was at night, like in the middle of the night. So actually, it was the morning, but it was like 3 in the morning, 2 or 3 in the morning. She ravenous, absolutely ravenous. And she has to eat. Um, and she's saying, "Is this normal, or is this something, Doctor R, you have ever heard of? Please, I'm now a year into taking my hormones, and still the same with this crazy hunger thing, and I really don't know what to do."
There's definitely more information needed for this specific patient. And there's some really good food for thought here. And that symptom of waking up at night and feeling ravenously hungry and like you got to eat. It isn't a
Yeah,
question about
she gotta eat.
it isn't a question about willpower.
Mm,
Eat. That's known as, in most cases, what's going on there is a phenomenon called hypoglycemia. And what that is we need glucose to live. And it's so important that the body has these exquisite mechanisms to make sure that the glucose doesn't go too high and does not go too low. And that going too low is unacceptable. If that blood glucose goes too low, you'll lose consciousness. You'll go unconscious.
diabetes?
Severe hypoglycemia, which is not very common. The blood glucose drops too low, your brain won't work.
Yeah.
You'll lose. So, no worries. We have these built-in protective mechanisms that are outrageous to make sure the blood glucose is kept within a nice normal range, not too little and not too much. And I'm just going to handle the not too little thing. So hypoglycemia is the blood glucose dropped too low and the protective mechanisms did not click in. So the ultimate protective mechanism clicked in called hunger. Eat more glucose or food that will break down into glucose. And it's a very strong drive and it's not to be denied. And that's what my suspicion is. What's happening is the woman's glucose is dropping too low at night. Now I want to switch topics or switch approaching this. Very often you'll hear from women in menopause who are very symptomatic from low hormones. They go on hormones and they start saying, "Oh my God, I'm gaining weight." And the most common situation is they were dehydrated because these hormones are a very important part of maintaining adequate hydration. And the moment they went on the hormones, their hydration got better. Eventually their skin will even look nicer because it has more hydration in it. and they gained a pound or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of water immediately. But that ain't the one that the women are concerned about.
Mm.
Women are concerned about the additional fat tissue that can come on board, and how does that happen? Well, we know for certain that women who have too little estrogen are going to gain weight. They're going to gain adipose weight. And we also know that women who have too much estrogen are going to gain weight. And so, because in the methods that we use and that we teach, we are really intense about keeping those levels where they belong. And we know how to measure through 24-hour urine hormone testing. And I've yet to see another system of measuring. And we're doing cross testing on this. We're doing split sample testing to see if saliva or 5-point urine on filter paper or blood works. Right now, the evidence is too early for me to really comment on, but I don't see much promise outside of the 24-hour urine hormone test to date. But to be continued in the future, we'll be reporting on these. We're doing an actual study. But because anyone who specializes in hormones, and they're seeing hormonal patients day in and day out, like we have a advising compounding pharmacist in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Shout out to Mary Lee.
Mm.
She's seeing women 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And she's been doing it for years. And she's had our training and other trainings as well. And she knows a lot. And when she hears something like gaining weight, there's going to be a lot of different things that she's going to be able to check into, including getting a very precise estrogen level to make sure the woman doesn't have too much or too little. Now, I wanted to start with hypoglycemia because that makes me wonder, why isn't this woman's protective mechanisms in place? Because though I don't have a sufficient amount of information, I think this woman is waking up with a great deal of hunger, has got hypoglycemia. And we can test that and we can remedy it. Like people who have severe hypoglycemia, let's not even talk about menopause or hormones, because this occurs outside of people. If they've lost the ability to protect themselves with the very specific mechanisms that protect against blood glucose doing too low, well, we do strategies. And these women or men, sometimes they must have a bedtime snack before they go to bed, even if it's late. You got to be careful. You don't want to eat something that's not going to digest well and keep you awake and give you heartburn or reflux. So you don't want to eat a steak at 11 o'clock at night.
Let alone make it.
Right. And you don't want to have something like a Coca-Cola ever, period, never.
Correct.
Or even orange juice, because that's pure glucose. That's a bit of a shock to the system. You want to have something that's got enough carbohydrate in it, but will digest slowly. So it'll last over a couple hours. So the classic is tapioca. It's a starch. I'm not talking about tapioca pudding that you've dumped a ton of sugar into in the preparation of. I'm talking about pure tapioca without the sugar. Slow to digest, gradually releasing carbohydrates, keeping your glucose up. There are some patients with hypoglycemia, they've got to eat every couple hours or every hour. And we don't want them to wake up hungry. That's harsh. So some people in the extreme situation, they've got to set an alarm to wake up prior to them getting very hungry. So it depends how severe you've got a case going on there. And meanwhile, you try and correct the underlying issue. What's the underlying issue? Well, for one thing, I'm not talking about taking in more calories in a 24-hour period. I'm talking about spreading them out. So people who have severe hypoglycemia, they have to eat every hour and a half. And we want them to eat before they get hungry, because hunger is like a late screaming alarm. Oh my God, I'm really hurting here. We don't want them to get hungry. We don't want them to have more calories than they should. We just want to spread them out. So there's a way to address hypoglycemia. I'm not saying that these are or not related to the hormones. And I've named the issues. Too much or too little hormones can lead to weight gain as well. There's other things to consider. What's driving that hypoglycemia? Sometimes what's happening, and this refers back to a question that was asked earlier, the rescue remedies aren't present anymore. The principal rescue for a falling blood glucose are two powerful hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. Oh, didn't we mention them earlier? These raise your blood glucose. You need elevated blood glucose to fight or flee from a saber-toothed tiger. And the premier blood glucose raisers on the planet Earth are called adrenaline and cortisol. Well, if you, like most human beings, have been overworking your adrenal glands for 5 decades, the adrenal glands, they just lose their ability to produce the amount of hormones that are ideal, and you start getting symptoms like hypoglycemia. Because you can't raise that blood glucose. If someone came to an emergency room and they were in hypoglycemia, we would give them intravenous glucose, but we'd also give them intravenous adrenaline or some kind of cortisol. We'd raise it up immediately. Easy to do. But if you can't do that internally, then we start asking the question, are your adrenal glands putting out the level of hormones you need? And does the hot flash that happens in the middle of the night, is that part of the problem? So that's a third thing that we need to look at is she waking up because she had a hot flash, whether she felt it or not? That hot flash can take place in the sleep, and a woman doesn't notice she had the hot flash. All she notices is the racing mind and the energized, that's an output of adrenaline. So all these things have to be taken into account when you hear something like that ravenous appetite in the middle of the night.
Yeah. Yeah. The word ravenous really got me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this is not a problem for someone who spent thousands and thousands of hours of their life on planet Earth studying and practicing what it takes to become a physician or nurse practitioner. This is what we do. And then the additional education, which is very extensive. We're not taught how to do this in medical school or in internship or in residencies. This has to come from additional training above and beyond our traditional, and those resources are out there. In fact, we of the Institute of Bioidentical Medicine, we're a major resource for training physicians and nurse practitioners. This is how I spend 90% of my time. I train and mentor physicians and nurse practitioners on how to treat women and men in midlife with compounded bioidentical hormones. So your job becomes the same. If you're getting hypoglycemic in the middle of the night, you need some help. There's I mentioned some stopgap measures, but you want a naturopathic physician or a healthcare provider that's functional medicine that can help you sort out what's going on here. How many different moving parts are there? Are the adrenal glands really doing what they need to do to rescue you and not get you hypoglycemic? Is there something in your diet? Is there something in your supplement programs? And getting those hormones correct. We always love self-help. And I never want to make things sound outside the ability of someone to figure it out themselves. And you can, but a story I've told many times is when I was 28, I decided to rebuild my Corvair van engine because I loved cars and I loved tinkering with cars. And by golly, I did. It took me 3 months. It was,
About the same time as medical school?
well, it was during my internship. And at night I would go out to the garage and take the next step to rebuild my Corvair. And I had an instructional manual how to rebuild Corvair van engines, and it was so much fun, and I just enjoyed it so much. And I put that engine back together, and by God, that automobile ran for 7,000 miles, at which point it froze.
Oops.
never, never to move again. And then I had a Volkswagen van many years later, and it needed a rebuild. And I took it to a guy who had an automobile mechanic who had rebuilt hundreds and hundreds of Volkswagens. And I was so curious. I asked him if I could watch him, and he did hundreds of things that I never thought of doing. They weren't in the book. The way he was handling the bearings, for example, and all this stuff, and the tools he had to do it. I went, no wonder that car only ran 7,000 miles. This is a long way of saying is that we all have our special gifts. And when you get into technical issues like hypoglycemia in the middle of the night, you can figure it out. And better, you should go to someone who that's their bread and butter. They got very interested in that. And there's a widespread interest among healthcare providers of all types, health coaches too, that really understand functional medicine and have a lot of skills to help you deal with your nutrition and supplementation and exercise to address this symptom, which is the tip of the iceberg. You waking up with a ravenous appetite, don't worry. It's very unlikely you got anything serious going on, but it's a clue that will lead you, if you follow the bouncing ball, into nutrition, detoxification, exercise, and, oops, the elephant in the room, acquiring information and tools and support to get terrific with your mind and your emotions, and thus how you perceive life, your attitude, and how you make choices out of the wisdom that you have rather than out of the reactivity from past pain and suffering. That is the story of the biological stress response, fight or flight, that dismantles all these things. If you overuse that thing because of your thoughts and your emotions and how you're funking up relationships and your life and just stressing yourself and getting bent out of shape, that's how you eventually wind up with hypoglycemia in the middle of the night. So it's the doorway to this big topic that I see now. I would guess there's millions of Americans, women and men, who've made a decision. I want to become a better person. And I know I've got some work to do. And I'm going to seek out the resources. I'm going to go to the groups, the group therapies. I'm going to seek out the many mentors that are available and the resources that are available. I'm going into therapy. I'm going into alcohol. I'm going into Narcotics Anonymous. I'm going to do the great work. Because if you don't do it, your life is not going to work well. You're going to continue to trigger the biology of the fight or flight, and you're going to wear yourself out. And you're going to wind up in the middle of the night with something going on.
Or you can't sleep at all, period.
Yeah.
No, forget waking up. You're not going to sleep. Been there, done that.
So it's a big story, but it's the great story because the rewards of healing yourself, the rewards of acquiring information that relates to how you think, and tools. It relates to how you work well with uncomfortable emotions. What that leads to is better life choices. You choose better partners, you choose better friendships, you're more pleasant in your workday, you're more pleasant in your household because you're getting more and more skilled at coming home to who the truth of you are, and biologically you're not triggering the trouble.
Having more fun.
Having more fun and more love. So this great work has got great rewards, and it's the key to medicine. So I think it's a great place to end up for today, because it's the most important thing I'd ever have to say to any of you. Is
Yeah, and we will do that interview again because, boy, that's a great, great interview from you. And I love to ask you those questions and hear those answers.
so why don't we encourage people, if they want, to put it in the chat or put it in posts in Ins and Outs of Menopause, to put any questions. If I trigger any curiosity when I keep mentioning this quote great work, put your questions in Ins and Outs of Menopause, and we'll gather them together, and maybe we'll have a Facebook Live around that.
It would be wonderful. And I know because you've put it out there that you have done a lot of this great work. And I find that highly admirable. And I thank you for that and for sharing it. It's really good to see you, Dr. Rosensweet.
You too, Carolyn.
Thank you. I'm going to wish you a wonderful weekend, beginning of the week. I'll see you next Tuesday. I'll start with my last question and then we'll go on to the other ones because I got them.
All righty.
They are
Bye-bye.
recorded and they are available. Yes. Many blessings. Have a great time. We'll see everybody next Tuesday.
Bye-bye, everybody.
See you later. I'll get with you guys. See you later.